And then there is labor as love, exemplified by all those who volunteer their labor and don't get paid. Their reward is their joy in having helped others. Hospital receptionists, literacy tutors, shelter workers, the list goes on and on. We recently talked with Jean Zong, who's director of the Community Gardens of Tucson, who is helping us get our garden established. There are 12 community gardens in Tucson, and he is the director of 7 of them. He works full-time at this as a volunteer, and not just sitting at a desk either. He's out there in the hot sun, digging trenches and installing plumbing. In our own congregation, we see this kind of dedication in the many people who sing in the choir, maintain our website, greet people on Sunday, serve on the board, teach RE, extend hospitality, take care of the buildings and grounds, organize fundraisers, pinch hit as a musician, and do all the many other things that contribute to the well-being of the community. I won't start naming names, because if I did, I'd be sure to overlook someone and be embarrassed. But we all know who these people are, and we appreciate their labors of love. Labor as identity. Part of our culture in the US is labor as identity. In other cultures, it is often different. I remember reading about a military man who shared a tent with a British officer for 2 years. And in all that time, the Britisher never asked him whether he was married or what he did in civilian life. Can you imagine that? In the US, we routinely ask new acquaintances, what do you do? We define ourselves by our jobs. I'm a bus driver. I'm a dentist. I'm a homemaker. I'm a nurse. We expect everyone to have a job. It's part of who we are. Even rich people, like CEOs of big companies, go to work every day. Labor as class marker. Labor is a class marker in other cultures. In European society 150 years ago or so, people were defined by whether they had to work or not. Only the lower ranks had to work. It has always seemed wrong to me that a whole class of people existed just to do the work for another whole group. For example, if you were Lord and Lady Marmaduke, you had a chauffeur to drive you and take care of your vehicles. You had a cook. You had a nanny for your children, and when they got older, a governess or a tutor. You had a gardener or a team of gardeners. You had a parlor maid to dust and clean and carry water and coal. You had a lady's maid or a valet to hang up your clothes and keep them clean and mended. You even had a boot boy to polish your shoes. You yourself didn't have to do any work. You could read, paint watercolors, go hunting, visit acquaintances, and give elaborate dinner parties. Of course, now we have mechanical servants to help with many of the tasks that human servants once did, but we all expect to have to work. One of the best things about American society, in my opinion, is that we all have turns to be both master and servant. For example, Maxine has a salon and does Hilda's hair and nails. She is in the role of servant and Hilda is the master. But when Maxine takes her car to George to repair, she is the master and he is the servant. Then George goes out to eat and is served by Terry. Terry's children are educated by Carl, who is a teacher. If Carl goes to the hospital, he is taken care of by Pat, a nurse's aide. And so it goes. In a perfect world, we would all have equal chances to be master and servant, but unfortunately, the balance is still skewed. Labor as myth. Work hard and you'll get ahead. It's part of the American dream. It's a much older myth than that. Remember Aesop's fable of the ant and the grasshopper? The ant worked all summer to stockpile resources while the grasshopper played. Then, when winter came, the ant was able to survive. And then there's the story of the little red hen, who couldn't get her fellow animals to help her plant the wheat, harvest it, grind it, mix it up, and bake it as bread. But they were all too willing to eat the bread when it was made. The moral of these stories is obvious. You need to work for what you get. One wonders if Lord and Lady Marmaduke ever read them and what they thought they did. The Horatio Alger stories in our own culture embody this same myth. For example, a poor boy starts off selling newspapers on the street, but by diligence and hard work rises to a position of power in the company. By the way, it's not a very well-known fact, but Horatio Alger was a Unitarian minister, although not a very successful one. He resigned after 2 years, and then he went on to write all his books. The work hard myth is one we'd like to believe that labor will bring its rewards. Unfortunately, this doesn't always happen. Millions of people work as hard as they can and don't get ahead. Millions of others can't even find a job to work at. In these cases, labor reverts to being merely survival. Labor as a right. The labor movements of past years campaigned for all people who want to work to have not only that right, but also a right to decent wages and good working conditions. Our closing song today is one that was used during a mill workers' strike in Massachusetts in 1912, and it makes the case, metaphorically, for workers' right to both bread and roses. Labor as a political issue. Labor has always been political. From slave labor in Egypt many millennia before the Common Era, to the Luddites who opposed the Industrial Revolution in England, there they are, in the 1800s, to the overriding issue of the US in the 19th century, slavery, to the turn of the 20th century, factory strikes, with organized labor protesting working conditions. These issues have always been with us. Two of our hottest hot-button political issues today are concerned with labor. The economic situation in our country with unemployment at almost 10%, and the immigration from Mexico and Latin America by people seeking work. How should we think about labor in terms of our UU principles? Two of them seem particularly relevant. The first is the inherent worth and dignity of all people. Most people feel their sense of self-worth diminished if they don't have a job. They feel robbed of their dignity when they have to accept welfare. They feel like failures if they can't provide for their families. I don't want to take a particular political stance here because I know we all have different ideas about how things should be done, and we value that diversity. But I believe we need to support in whatever way we best can, with our votes, our voices, our resources, our labor, measures that will increase jobs in our society and help our economy regain its health. The second relevant UU principle is justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. When we see how immigrants are viewed and how they are treated by American society, there is precious little justice, equity, or compassion evident. Is it just that we as a society should have vastly greater wealth than another society? Is it equitable that migrants should be paid less for their work than American citizens and have to do without benefits? Is it compassionate to say, build higher walls, keep them out, without any thought for their plight as human beings, with families like ours, and the same need to experience the dignity of labor, the self-esteem that comes from having a job? Our UUA president, Reverend Peter Morales, sums up the situation better than anyone I've ever heard. This is what he says. We must acknowledge that the United States is largely responsible for the influx of immigrants across our southern border. Our economic policies are helping to create wrenching economic dislocations in Mexico, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, while at the same time, US companies and consumers demand and benefit from the cheap labor that immigrants supply. Businesses, consumers, citizens, and undocumented workers are profoundly connected in a vast, interdependent economic web. We cannot solve the problem by scapegoating and casting out the most vulnerable members of a system we created and profit from. End quote. We need to make our society more just, equitable, and compassionate. We need to support whatever programs can include foreigners, either guest workers or potential citizens, pay them fairly and treat them well. We have a long way to go, but this issue demands resolution. In summary, labor should never be about bondage. It has to be more than just survival. In its best embodiment, it should represent an opportunity to fulfill our human need for dignity and self-respect.